Hello, biology! In this lesson, we're going to go over, or in this recording, we're going to go over the lesson Genetic Factors in Inheritance. The objective is to use scientific information to show that traits are often the result of various genetic factors that interact with each other. So in the previous lesson, you were introduced to genetics and the passing on of traits. And we're going to move beyond what you learned in the previous, so it gets more complicated. Remember that any yellow star indicates that a quick check question is being covered on that slide. Don't yell at me if I missed one, but for the most part, I think I did a good job. Okay, so last lesson, just to recap, you learned about Mendel and his crosses with pea plants and how he learned about this idea of dominance and recessive, and that individuals have these genetic components or these versions of traits. And today we call those alleles, and those are versions of a gene. So a gene codes for something, and there's different versions of what you can code for. He also, Mendel, also determined that individuals have two copies of each gene, so two versions, and that versions can either be dominant or recessive. So he came up with those terms dominant and recessive. And today we use letters to represent the alleles. And if something is a dominant allele, we use a capital letter. And if it's a recessive allele, we use the lowercase letter. So we each have two copies, which means our genotype, our genetic makeup, can either be homozygous or heterozygous. It's homozygous when the alleles are the same. So you could either have homozygous recessive, so little t, or homozygous dominant, big T, big T. Heterozygous, hetero means different. So heterozygous means you have different alleles. So you can have big T, little t. Now these are the genotypes, and the genotypes determine the phenotype. Right, so the genotype is the genetic makeup, what you have in your genes and your DNA, but the combination of alleles that you have and their interactions determine the phenotype. Now this is an example here, attached earlobes, whether you have like dangling down ones or if they are attached, is an example of Mendelian inheritance in humans. So that one trait is determined, this trait is determined by one gene, and the alleles at the gene have a dominant recessive relationship. So that means that the heterozygote individual, the individual that's big E, little e, would have the dominant trait, so the detached earlobes. Now, one thing I want to point out, that dominant does not mean better. It just means that the allele gets expressed, that trait gets expressed no matter what, if you have that allele. Okay, that's what dominant means. It does not mean it's better than the other one. Okay. And recessive does not mean it's worse. It just means that something is not being expressed usually. And you have to, the only way you see that trait in someone is if it's a homozygous recessive, homozygous genotype. Okay, so we're going to cover a lot of different other interactions or other types of inheritance patterns that you can see. These are all considered non-Mendelian inheritance, meaning that there's not this dominant recessive and it's not possibly just one gene. So let's look at them. First one, incomplete dominance. Kind of what it sounds like. Another term for it is incomplete inheritance, but this is when traits blend, when the heterozygous individual looks different from the two homozygous individuals. And so with incomplete dominance, the heterozygote looks different from the homozygote individuals. So in this case, we've got, the red flower is a homozygous genotype, and the white flower is another homozygous genotype. They have the same alleles. This pink one is a heterozygote. It has one R, one W, and its genotype, or phenotype, sorry, is in the middle between them. Having one R did not give it enough pigment to become completely red. And you can see this in some, other animal coding colors where, you have a dark color, a light color, and then something that's kind of in between, a blend. That's incomplete dominance. Now, it often gets confused with codominance. These two get confused. Codominance is when more than one allele is dominant. Both are dominant. So you see both traits. It's not a blending. Both are expressed. Both are shown. So in this flower, this species of flower, its alleles have a codominant relationship where we see some red or dark pink and some white. It's not like a lighter pink. All the petals are not a lighter pink. We see both colors. Same thing is happening with this cattle. This cattle is called a roan cattle, and you see it in horses as well. But with the roan, it's a codominant relationship, and that both the brown and the white are being expressed. The individual hairs are both brown. Some are white. It's not a blending. It's not like a light brown color. So there is a question on the quick check doing a Punnett square with a codominant trait where you have one black individual. So let's say this is mom, and then you have a white individual. Let's say this is dad. And what's the probability of something during a cross? So here's how you would set up their Punnett square. So here's what mom's allele. So if she's black, big B, and then the white, big W, and then in here are the possible outcomes for the offspring. And hopefully you've noticed already that they're all big W, big B. They're all heterozygotes. So they all will have the phenotype of black feathers and white feathers. So they'll all have that same phenotype. All right, the next example of non-Mendelian inheritance are multiple alleles. So this is when there are two alleles for the characteristic. So we're not talking big E, little e. We're talking there's multiple alleles, more than two. The classic example for this is blood type. For blood type, there's three alleles. You have big A, big B, and O. This is also an example of codominance because A and B are both dominant. O is the recessive one. So you can have different types of blood types. You can have A blood type, meaning you make that A antigen. B blood type, you make a B antigen. If you are AB, then you make both of them. If you are O blood type, you are homozygous recessive, and you're not making any of those antigens. So multiple alleles, and those alleles can have different interactions. So complicated, I know. All right, next type of non-Mendelian inheritance is epistasis. This is when the alleles of one gene mask the effects of a phenotype at another. So you're talking about two different genes, and one of the genes will affect the expression of the other one. So an example, let's talk about hair color. Hair color is genetically determined. What color hair you have? Well, let's say you have a gene that makes you bald and you can't make any hair. All right, that would be an example of epistasis. If you have a gene that you can't make any hair, and that people do have this, it wouldn't matter what genes you have for hair color because you wouldn't have any hair for that to be seen, right? And this does happen. A more common example is with coloring in Labrador retrievers, the dog breed. I think if you're familiar with dogs and labs, you know that there's three main colors. There's the black lab, yellow lab, and a chocolate lab. So for lab coloring, there is a gene that determines their coat color, and there is a dominant recessive relationship there, where the dominant trait is the black. Right, so black individuals, black labs, have at least one big B. All right, if they're homozygous recessive, they are chocolate colored. However, there's another gene that they have that gives them the ability to make any pigments at all. So this other gene that allows them to make pigments at all in their fur, if they are homozygous recessive and can't make pigments, then it doesn't matter what their coat color is, they're going to be yellow. So again, the genotype at this gene is affecting the genotype of that gene. So here's some, picture just kind of showing different genotypes and what phenotype you see. There is a slight difference in the yellow labs that have, that would have been, black labs if they weren't homozygous recessive for being able to make coat color. They do have slightly darker peripheral stuff like this, like darker nose, darker eye rims, etc. But these individuals are homozygous recessive for being able to produce coat color, so they're yellow. And then these individuals here have the ability to make pigments in their coat color and then are either brown if they are homozygous recessive for that gene, or black if they are heterozygous or homozygous dominant. So that's epistasis. Next one, polygenic inheritance. This is when two or more genes determine a phenotype. So not all phenotypes are just determined by one gene. So things that have quantitative characteristics, so things that have like a huge range of phenotypes where you see like every possible option throughout a spectrum, those are called polygenic inheritance. All right. Skin color is a great example. You see very, very light skin to very, very dark skin. Height is another example. You see, very short people to very tall people. It means more than one gene is contributing to that trait. All right, the next example of non-Mendelian inheritance is pleiotropy. And this is when one gene, it's kind of the opposite, when one gene affects many phenotypes. So it affects many different traits. You see this often with different genetic mutations and syndromes, like Marfan syndrome. Marfan syndrome is a one nucleotide difference in a gene that helps create connective tissue. And connective tissue is the tissues that join your bones together. Well, individuals with this one mutation and this one gene have a whole slew of characteristics and phenotypes. So they tend to be taller, they have longer arms and legs and fingers and toes, but they also have, some issues with their heart, same issues with the heart. Their mouth that has a certain shape. They, their vision isn't always great. Their chest has a certain characteristic. So all these different phenotypes, physical characteristics, come about because of this one mutation. And that's pleiotropy. All right, we reached the end. Your multiple choice question for this video is, which of the following is not an example of non-Mendelian inheritance? So is it incomplete dominance, codominance, pleiotropy, or dominance? Which one is not non-Mendelian? So which one would be Mendelian? Which one is the Mendelian inheritance? All right. Thank you for listening. Let me know if you have any questions.